Hey nerds. So, going to talk about Habermas's book, The Philosophical Discourse on Modernity. And in order to get into this paragraph of that book, we'll have to get into who Habermas is and Hegel and Kant. So, and we're going to talk about Habermas' criticism of Hegel's attempt to unite reason and faith because it's a false dichotomy, which I think he makes a good point about. But anyway, so we'll get into Kant first here. So, in the other series that I've been doing on the book, the Cambridge Companion to Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, the so Kant was a 1700s Enlightenment philosopher, and his views on metaphysics are explained in that book, and his views on metaphysics are relevant to this paragraph too. So he had kind of an on again, off again relationship with metaphysics, which remember is basically the study and speculation about the cosmic nature and structure of the universe. And Kant had a hard on for his grand philosophical system that supposedly tells us the true nature of the structure and function of the universe. So he had the correct metaphysical system, according to Kant, of course, just like every philosopher. So Kant, he claimed to have found a universally accepted standard for knowledge. So he retconned his previous brutal takedown of metaphysics and said that it was merely necessary skepticism for making his philosophical system work. Kant decided that the foundation of his metaphysics was morality. He just needed a method. He wanted to determine the proper ends and limits of human desires and power, but he still hadn't found his method. Instead, Kant sketched out what he called the science of the limits of human reason. Can Kant find the method for his metaphysics of morals that will show us the science of the limits of human reason, power, and desire? We get into we get well, I've gotten into that more in another video, but we haven't explored his metaphysical system as much, so I'm pretty sure we're going to get into that more in the as we continue the series on Cambridge Companion Companion's critique to Kant's critique of of pure reason. That's a hard book title to say. So anyway, oh right, first we'll get into Hegel and Habermas here too, of course. Remember that Habermas, he was a 20th century critical theorist in the Frankfurt School, and the book I'm talking about, remember, is a philosophical discourse of modernity, and he gets into subjects like Hegel, Fichte, reason, and religion. And remember, for my Slavoj Žižek series called on his book called Less Than Nothing, he gets into the views of Hegel and Fichte partially because uh, Zizek himself is a Lacanian slash Hegelian slash Marxist, as we know. And he gets into that a lot in that book as well. So anyway, Habermas was majorly influenced by Adorno and Horkheimer, both of whom were also critical theorists in the Frankfurt School. And let's get into oh, right, I forgot to mention Hegel there, but we'll get into Hegel more. So, critical theorists in the Frankfurt School, like Habermas, Adorno, and Horkheimer, were so-called cultural Marxists, but they weren't the same as classical Marxists. They had many interesting and valid criticisms of Marx. They wrote much more about topics like culture, history, and aesthetics, particularly Habermas. They're often falsely labeled as cultural Marxists. The critical theorists in the Frankfurt School are falsely called cultural Marxists because some of them often get into subjects like how Marxism continued to impact culture and aesthetics in their modern Western culture long after the Berlin Wall fell. They're very different from actual Marxists in a classical sense because they did not adopt Marxism as their political ideology. They were not classical Marxists. They just wrote about Marx. Habermas wrote quite a lot on Hegel, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, or maybe it's Friedrich. who was an 18th and 19th century philosopher of German idealism. And we're going to get into his critique of, well, Habermas's critique of Kant and Hegel's metaphysical systems here, and then we get into Habermas's critique of Hegel. So we get into the paragraph here, and then I'll explain it more, and then we're going to get into Habermas's critique of Hegel. Okay, so in 1802, when Hegel dealt with the systems of Kant and Fichte from the standpoint of the antithesis between faith and knowledge, his aim was to burst the philosophy of subjectivity from within. Nevertheless, he did not proceed in a rigorously immanent fashion. He was tacitly relying on a diagnosis of the age of enlightenment. This alone entitled him to presuppose the absolute, that is, to suppose reason in a way different from the philosophy of reflection as the power of unification. So remember, I alluded to at the start of this video that Habermas was going to get into Hegel's attempt to unify reason and faith through his critique partially of Kant's metaphysical system. So I'm going to get into like a more detailed, my own more detailed explanation of this a little bit, and then we'll get into Habermas's critique of Hegel's attempt to unite reason and faith. Okay, so I already mentioned Kant, and so Hegel dealt with Kant and Fichte's philosophical systems. Like I said, he approached this from the perspective of there being an antithesis between faith and knowledge. That's Hegel's. That's not actually the way he poses it, though. It's basically it's the position he presents in order to critique it. So so he approached this from the perspective of there being an antithesis between faith and knowledge. Remember from my series on Less Than Nothing, Zizek, that Fichte criticizes Hegel's supposed system of absolute knowledge. Hegel's is based on a philosophy of the subject, while Fichte's system is based on a philosophy of subjectivity. The goal behind Hegel's vantage point from an assumed position. Wait, did I explain who Fichte was? Okay, I will explain who Fichte is. Don't worry. So, Fichte criticizes Hegel's supposed system of absolute knowledge. Hegel's is based on a philosophy of the subject, while Fichte's system is based on a philosophy of subjectivity. The goal behind Hegel's vantage point from an assumed position between faith and knowledge is to destroy the philosophy of subjectivity from within. See, like I said, he's presenting the position in order to criticize it and deconstruct it. So Habermas thinks that Hegel didn't explore this idea vigorously enough. To him, Hegel's problem was relying on a flawed diagnosis of the age of enlightenment. He used this to presuppose the absolute. Due to Hegel's false diagnosis of the Enlightenment, his destruction of Fichte's philosophy of subjectivity didn't work. Hegel's mistake is also why his system of absolute knowledge based on the philosophy of the subject fails. It stands on a broken foundation. In Hegel's system, he presents reason as having the power to unify both knowledge and faith. To him, we can arrive at absolute knowledge through the philosophy of the subject by using reason to reconcile the false dichotomy between faith and knowledge. But since Hegel's philosophy of the subject and supposed dismantling of subjectivity relies on using reason to unite faith and knowledge, does this make faith and knowledge irreconcilable in reality? If his system of absolute knowledge based on the philosophy of the subject fails, it seems impossible to unify knowledge and faith with reason in order to achieve absolute knowledge. So we're going to get into more of Habermas's criticism of Hegel's like attempt to unify reason and faith, basically, in order to reach absolute knowledge through his metaphysical system. Well, not Habermas's metaphysical system, but criticizing Hegel's attempt to achieve his metaphysical system in order to reach absolute knowledge through uniting reason and faith in order to achieve absolute knowledge. Okay, so we're going to get into more on Hegel's talk about it and then Habermas's comments on it. So, civilization has raised this latest era so far above the ancient antithesis of philosophy and positive religion that this opposition of faith and knowledge has now been transferred into the field of philosophy itself. The question arises, however, whether victorious reason has not suffered the same fate that the barbarous nations in their victorious strength have usually suffered at the hands of civilized nation that weakly succumb to them. So, reason did well in its use as a critique tool, but it's gone too far. It's reached its limits, and now it's not as effective anymore. It's self-justifying itself on faith as an a priori. Okay, so the whether the question arises, however, whether victorious reason has not suffered the same fate that the barbarous nations in their victorious strength have usually suffered at the hands of civilized nations that weakly succumb to them. As rulers, the barbarians may have held the upper hand outwardly, but they surrendered to the defeated spiritually. Enlightened reason won a glorious victory over what it believed in its limited conception of religion to be faith as opposed to reason. Yet, seen in this clear light, the victory comes to no more than this: the positive element with which reason busied itself to do battle is no longer religion, and victorious reason is no longer reason. So, once reason it's won, it it's no longer reason anymore. Like I said, it's just reason rationalizing itself with reason and becoming a circular argument. And so it's just taken on faith, and it's an a priori claim basically. So since it doesn't need to be justified anymore, there the reason doesn't have rationality behind it, even though it seems like it does, because you're just using this a priori to rationalize your preconceptions without actually having to justify the claim that reason and rationality can help you arrive at this conclusion, basically. So Habermas comments on this now. So Hegel was convinced that the age of the Enlightenment and culminating in Kant and Fichte had erected merely an idol in reason. It had falsely put under. I don't remember if I mentioned, but Fichte was the founder of German idealism, which Hegel was a student in, and Kant wasn't a student in, but he was heavily studied by people like Hegel and other people who were influenced and by and influenced him, right? Okay, so anyway, so reason had falsely put understanding or reflection in the place of reason, and thus elevated something finite to the status of an absolute. So finite reason assumed the status of an absolute. The infinite element of the philosophy of reflection was in truth merely posited by the understanding, a rational element that exhausts itself in the negation of the finite. In that understanding fixes it, it posits the infinite as absolutely opposed to the finite. So, he's implying that the infinite and the finite are also a false dichotomy in the same way that reason and faith are a false dichotomy, right? So, which is interesting, of course. And reflection, which has elevated itself to reason in that it sublated the finite. So, if you reflect, then that's reason, and then that's what you can use to rationally justify your conclusion that there's a dichotomy between reason and faith. So, reflection had elevated itself to reason in that it sublated the finite. And this has again degraded itself, which means that reason has again degraded itself to the understanding in fixing the activity of reason in opposition. Moreover, so it's always in opposition of faith, right? So, moreover, it now makes the pretension of being rational even in this relapse, which I think is interesting, relapse of rationality and reason. However, as the unqualified talk about relapse shows, So this where Habermas gets into his criticism of Hegel's position. Hegel surreptitiously slips in here what he is attempting to demonstrate. He ought first to demonstrate and not simply to presuppose, because realize his criticism is also relying on an a priori. So his, in my opinion, valid critique, Hegel's valid critique, also relies on an assumption that he doesn't realize, which means he hasn't actually proved his position is in the same way as the people he criticizes, because the a priori that he's criticizing, his vantage point of criticism is also based on an a priori, right? So Hegel ought first to demonstrate and not simply to presuppose that a kind of reason which is more than an absolutized understanding can convincingly reunify the antithesis that reason has to unfold discursively. What encouraged Hegel to presuppose an absolute power of unification, therefore, are not so much arguments as biographical experiences, namely those crisis experiences of contemporary history. Probably some examples are the Holocaust and the communist dystopias like Stalinism and Maoism, for example, and definitely Nazi Germany, of course. Um, that so those crisis experience of contemporary history that he gathered and worked through in the Frankfurt School and other places. So Hegel was somewhat involved with the Frankfurt School, but only for a very short period of time. So anyway, I think both Hegel and Habermas's points are valid, but so I think all of their points are valid. So I think Hegel's critique of Kant's and Fichte's approaches systems of metaphysical systems of absolute knowledge. Hegel disproves Kant, Kant and Fichte's Hegel's systems of absolute knowledge, but and to me he also proves through argument at least that there's a false dichotomy between reason and faith, and then Habermas proves that that Hegel also uses his own consumption from his vantage point of his own assumption in order to criticize Kant and Fichte's metaphysical system that help us to arrive at absolute knowledge. So this means that actually neither Kant, Fichte, nor Hegel reach at can arrive at absolute knowledge. And Habermas doesn't pose his own system, if I understand correctly, but you don't need to. And I think his criticism of Hegel is brilliant. So I think the point of this is that neither neither Kant, Fichte, or Hegel have arrived at absolute knowledge. Neither of them can use their own standards. Kant with his foundation of morality, Hegel with the foundation of, I think it was subjectivity. And so it can't be morality, neither morality nor subjectivity, nor reason, nor faith, nor the unification between them can be bases for your system of morality. So essentially, uh, Habermas eradicates, I'm going to say that again. Habermas eradicates Hegel's criticism of Kant and Fichte's metaphysical system. So, Kant, Fichte, and Hegel cannot achieve absolute knowledge. So, Kant, Fichte, and Hegel know nothing. Kant, Fichte, and Hegel all know nothing.